Welcome back, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. The Swiss government is working to offer a more attractive deal aimed at reducing additional tariffs on Swiss exports. Swiss President Cloudburts is set to travel to Washington today for discussions with US officials. The Kremlin has said that countries have the right to choose their own trade partners, including India. Moscow has also rejected criticism from the US about India's stance on Russia, calling pressure to halt trade with Russia illegal and threatening. Meanwhile, Russia's Ministry of Defense reports that its forces have captured the town of Sychnaiv in Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk region, further escalating tensions in the ongoing war. The Kremlin has declared that Russia no longer feels bound by any restrictions on deploying intermediate-range missiles, signalling a potential shift in its military strategy. Reports suggest that the EU is preparing sanctions for Russia over allegations that Beijing is supplying drones to Russia secretly. Alarms have been raised in Brussels over Chinese support for Russia amid its war against Ukraine. Tensions between Russia and Moldova continue to rise. The Kremlin has accused Moldova of undermining democracy following the sentencing of a pro-Russian regional leader to 7 years in prison. The leader was convicted for funneling money from Russia to support his political party. The US has condemned an order from Brazil's Supreme Court placing former President Jair Bolsonaro under house arrest. The right-wing ally of Donald Trump is standing trial over allegations that he plotted a coup to overturn an election, which he denies. The dismembered remains of 32 people have been found in an abandoned house in Mexico, according to prosecutors. The discovery was made in Guanajuato, where violence is prevalent. 15 people have so far been positively identified from the remains. And Sean Diddy Combs has been denied his latest bail request while awaiting sentencing after being convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution. The music mogul will remain in custody with his sentencing set for October the 3rd. We start this hour as Swiss President Karin Keller-Sutter and Business Minister Guy Parmelin will fly to Washington for trade talks with the US on Tuesday, that according to the Swiss government. According to reports, Switzerland will try to avoid 39% tariffs which were announced by President Donald Trump on exports to the United States. The Swiss government has said that the pair will facilitate meetings with the US authorities and hold talks to improve the tariff situation for Switzerland. According to reports, it is not yet confirmed whether they will be meeting with the US president or his officials. This comes after the Swiss government said that it was ready to make a more attractive offer to the United States. The Federal Council also held an emergency meeting and said it was ready to pursue negotiations beyond August the 7th, which was a deadline. The Swiss government has reportedly given no details of what extra incentives could be offered to secure a deal, but it did say it was not considering any countermeasures against the United States. Well, joining us to discuss these developments, Peter Cordio, Chief Market Economist at Spartan Capital Securities, who's joining us live from New York. Peter, as always, a pleasure to have you on the programme. How big is it that these Swiss officials are heading to Washington in search of a better deal?
I think it's a very positive step, and I think it's basically was the intentions all along of Trump and his administration to induce these representatives at high levels, by the way, to begin some sort of a negotiation that will eventually lead to some sort of a deal. And obviously, the steep tariffs that will likely be imposed and kicked off will not last that long. So I think it's a good sign. And I think this is basically the scope, the whole idea of putting on these steep tariffs to bring everyone to the negotiating table.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the Swiss president and business minister both travelling over, showing the significance of this meeting that could potentially take place with Donald Trump, though it's not yet confirmed. I posed a similar question to you previously, Peter, but do you think this could set a precedent, a high tariff placed on a country, and clearly the top decision makers in that nation doing everything that they can, including travelling to Washington to try and get this deal down?
Oh, absolutely. I think we'll see more of this, I believe President Trump has said that he would be meeting with the Prime Minister of Canada, and I would suspect he'd be meeting with many other leaders of other nations that need to close a deal that would be beneficial to both sides. Now, tariffs are not really the best way to go about it, but this is what the administration wants. They feel that they need to change the world order of trade, and that they can do it by doing it this way. 10% tariffs, if they bring it down to that level, which I don't think so, because Trump has said several times over and over that 15% is the base point. So I kind of think, it's going to be hefty and it's going to be inflationary, but it's certainly better than 35 or 40 or 50%. So I think the whole idea is to get negotiations going, and I'm very confident that deals will be made.
Yes, Peter, thank you for that insight. Please do stay with us as we shift our attention now to Ukraine, which has recovered drone parts reportedly sourced from India in Russian weapons used on the front lines and against civilians. That's according to Andriy Yermak, Chief of Staff to Ukraine's president. The discoveries add tensions to US pressure on India over its trade ties with Russia. President Trump recently threatened a 25% tariff on Indian imports, including a penalty for purchasing Russian oil. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov condemned Trump's remarks, calling them illegal coercion. Peskov emphasized that sovereign nations like India have the right to choose their trade partners and economic cooperation freely. New Delhi has rejected Washington's threats as unjustified and unreasonable, stating its oil imports from Russia are essential to ensure predictable and affordable energy for its citizens. The trade disagreement underscores growing tensions among Washington, Moscow, and New Delhi. Well, Peter, thank you for staying with us. Let's first look at trade, specifically the trade of oil. Of course, comments there from Peskov in Russia. How significant is this sort of potential destabilization from the US? Russia saying that countries can pick their own trading partners. India, of course, saying that it's more important to focus on the needs of the citizens and stability for an economy of almost 1.5 billion people. Do you think the US is potentially destabilizing the situation here for countries through their policies?
Well, everybody has the right to trade to whom they want to trade with. Of course, President Trump is basically tightening the screws on India, and he's trying to get that oil business. Now, does that mean that you're going to get it all? No, probably not. But does that mean that there might be a compromise somewhere along the line? I would imagine yes. But since the United States is the United States, and since the United States is the largest trading partner in the world with most countries, obviously it can demand certain requests. But does it necessarily mean that they will be honored? My guess is not. My guess is that India and even other nations will eventually engage in buying U.S. oil as well. That doesn't mean that they're going to have to abandon Russia or any other country that they deal with, but they would have to give, uh, I would imagine, to smooth down the diplomatic disagreement that's going on, and of course the threats by the Trump administration, that they will play the same game as they've been playing all along. At the end, they will give in. Do they give in to 100%?
Yes.
No, I don't think so.
Peter, I'm conscious of how much time we have left, and I do have a couple of quick points I want to cover. So if we could keep this shorter. Donald Trump's remarks relating to India purchasing Russian oil. Russia has called it illegal coercion. How do you see the way that Trump is using tariffs?
Well, again, I think it's just a threat, and I don't think it's a de facto situation.
Yes, and Peter, finally, of course, Ukraine say that they found Russian drones containing Indian parts. What could be the ramification for India? We've seen, and we broke earlier today, that the EU is potentially thinking about sanctions on China for potential Chinese parts in Russian drones. Could this potentially blow up to a wider geopolitical issue impacting countries like India and China, along with regions like the EU?
Absolutely, and that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing these steep tariffs, threats of steep tariffs and penalties being talked about, potentially being imposed on India.
Peter, thank you ever so much for your time. As always, such great insight on all of those topics there. We move on now, though, as Russia said that its army has seized a new village in Ukraine's central Dnipropetrovsk region, accelerating its claimed advance into the key industrial area. Russia has also reportedly taken control of the Yanvoskoye Sichnev settlement as well in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Russian forces have recently claimed to have captured territory in the region for the first time since the start of its offensive in 2022. While in the past week, Kyiv has denied any Russian presence in the region. Dnipropetrovsk is not one of the 5 Ukrainian regions that Moscow has publicly claimed as Russian territory. In a set of demands issued to Ukraine during talks in Istanbul that failed to yield a breakthrough, Moscow demanded formal recognition that these regions were part of Russia, and Kyiv has repeatedly ruled that out. Amid the ongoing tensions, President Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff is set to travel to Moscow before the US deadline to Russia to end the war expires. Well, joining us to discuss these developments, there's lots to cover. Shruti Dasgupta, an international affairs expert, joining us live from New Delhi. Shruti, as always, a pleasure to have you. Let's look at these reports of Russian expansions into Ukraine. We mentioned there are 5 regions which Russia sees as its territory, but the Dnipropetrovsk region isn't one of those. How significant are these advancements?
Greetings, Joshua. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think it comes from the fact that it is called the Donetsk People's Republic, and they prefer to have the Dnipropetrovsk region as part of theirs. And Russia is basically doing its job. It's put in a meat grinder there. They're advancing way into territories of Ukraine to ensure that the war can come to an end fast, and it is costing Ukraine not just face in terms of political circles, lots of military losses. I believe they demolished the command center of the 128th Brigade there. There were loss of lives and injuries. So it's a bigger positioning that they're saying that we're not going to be limited to what Ukraine claims or what are the 5 territories that we faced in the peace talks. If you come to the table and agree to it, you'll face lesser losses. If you do not, you will lose more than what you can actually bargain with.
Yes, Shruti, of course, Ukraine's response, and we've heard this throughout, is that the territory is all theirs and they don't want to concede any. But alluding to the point that you've just made, with 3 direct talks taking place in Istanbul and leading to no real progress in terms of a ceasefire or at least a temporary truce, Do you think that concessions will need to be made from Ukraine if any deal is to be agreed in the short term?
Well, any concession from Ukraine is something positive that Russia would accept. But Ukraine is not alone in this war. As you know, this war is NATO's war against Russia. And any kind of concessions they end up making, it makes Russia look bigger than NATO. And that is not something they can politically afford to have. Their anti-Russia policies are very strong, and their posturing regarding NATO bases is very singularly directed towards the Russian agenda. So they would not want Ukraine to submit, despite in 2022 there was a signed spring treaty with Russia between Ukraine and Russia at that time. That peace treaty was also violated by Zelensky. And so basically peace is not on the table for Zelensky or Ukraine, because they have to fight it out to the last man, it seems now.
Yes, and Shruti, we've just mentioned, of course, the fact that Steve Witkoff is headed to Moscow for further talks, potentially with Vladimir Putin. He's had several rounds of direct talks already. This in the midst of a clear deadline set by Donald Trump, trying to push Russia towards a potential peace deal. Do you see anything coming from Witkoff's potential meeting with Putin?
How do you talk peace when you have positioned your nuclear submarines in a more appropriate position where you can threaten Russia? Does that posturing lead to war, or does it lead to peace? This is the question that Putin will be asking Witkoff and the other people with him. What exactly are you asking of us if you're giving weapons? The German, I believe there was a statement out by Germany that that the Patriot missile systems possibly would be accessible to Ukraine as terms of long range. They've already, I think, in 2024 used a Storm Shadow against Russia that was provided by U.S. and its allies. So NATO and its allies have been very, very strong against Russia, and Russia has withstood everything they can throw it, and then the kitchen sink. So Putin is going to be asking Witkoff the very same questions, that now that you've put in the N word, and they've made it a three-statement response to the nuclear submarine repositioning, where they've called it very emotional, where they've called it not very effective to Russia, and they have managed to showcase Russia as a more responsible global force as compared to USA right now, where every word is measured and put out. So Witkoff is going with his hands tied behind his back because Trump managed to rattle a few cages that he couldn't afford to.
Shruti Dasgupta, as always, thank you ever so much for your time and your insight. Lots for us to cover continuously here on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We'll do so on NewsX World. Make sure you're staying tuned to that. Moving on to the United Kingdom, where former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has visited Taiwan on Tuesday, voicing strong support for the island amid growing pressure from China. Speaking during a meeting with President Lai Ching-te, Johnson said Taiwan does not deserve to be bullied and urged Western nations to strengthen political and economic ties with the democratic island. His remarks come as Beijing intensifies military activity near Taiwan, asserting claims the Taipei government firmly rejects. During a security forum hosted by Taiwan's Prospect Foundation, President Lai announced plans to raise defence spending to over 3% of GDP and called for deeper cooperation with democracies to build a democratic supply chain. The UK, which has no formal ties with Taiwan, recently sent a Royal Navy ship through the Taiwan Strait. Well, with us to discuss these comments made by the former UK Prime Minister, of course, amid tensions between China and Taiwan, Andrew Latham, a Professor of International Relations, joining us from Minnesota. Andrew, as always, it is a pleasure to be speaking to you. What do you make of these comments by Boris Johnson? Of course, a former leader, somebody who's fallen out of the main frame politically in the United Kingdom. Do you think there's any weight to his comments?
No, I think at one level that they're utterly irrelevant. He's not a player anymore. He obviously left office in disgrace and whatnot. Yet, and this is important, he channels very popular sentiments amongst the foreign policy establishments in both Washington and London and elsewhere, Ottawa, Paris, Berlin. And that is that although Taiwan is not an independent nation, it has an anomalous status, which is a function of the outcome of China's civil war in 1949. Nevertheless, it cannot be, according to Washington and London and Boris Johnson, forcibly incorporated into the People's Republic of China. If it does join with the mainland, it has to be voluntary. Now, Xi Jinping has invested a lot of his political capital in bringing Taiwan into the fold before he leaves office, which at the most will be a few years, and certainly before certain anniversaries come around, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, for example. So they are ramping up, the PRC, Beijing is ramping up the pressure. And the West is reacting in two ways, one of which is to heighten the rhetorical pushback. But the other one, especially in Washington, is to do things to reinforce Taiwan's military capacity to resist Beijing. And then there are bit players on the margins, the Brits, the Canadians, who periodically send a ship through the international waters, which they claim is international waters, the Taiwan Strait. China claims that it's internal Chinese waters, to make a point. But at the end of the day, Johnson is doing no more than echoing sentiments that are widely held in Western capitals.
Yes, and Andrew, very briefly, before we do move on, you mentioned there, of course, China strengthening their position on reunification. We have seen Western leaders talk about the one China policy. I'm thinking Friedrich Merz, who is one example, of course, the German Chancellor, who met with Wang Qi and reaffirmed that. Do you think that there will be a wider shift from Western nations if there is Chinese action on Taiwan?
I think there will be increased military aid and support to create a kind of porcupine. That's the language that's often used, turn Taiwan into a porcupine. But I don't see much movement on the diplomatic front. I think recognizing Taiwan as an independent country, the Republic of China, would be the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, and that would force Xi Jinping's hand, and then there would be military action against Taiwan, that's for sure. So military support, yes. Diplomatic support on the margins, recognition of the Republic of China, Taipei, Taiwan as an independent country, I don't see that in the cards.
Andrew, thank you ever so much for that insight. You will be staying with us as we move on. A Moldovan court today sentenced pro-Kremlin regional leader Evgenia Gutel to 7 years in jail for channeling money from Russia to finance a political party. Gutel, who has strongly criticised Moldova's current pro-European government and has occasionally visited Moscow to meet top officials, denied any wrongdoing. She has been placed on the EU and US sanctions lists on suspicion of destabilising Moldova. Prosecutors say Gutel systematically channeled undeclared funds into Moldova from 2019 to 2022 to finance the now banned pro-Moscow Shore Party, set up by Ilan Shor, an exiled pro-Russian businessman who has been convicted of fraud in Moldova. Prosecutors had been seeking a 9-year jail sentence for Gutel. The Kremlin condemned the sentence as politically motivated and accused Moldova of trampling on democracy. More than 100 people gathered in front of the court in the Moldovan capital, Chisinau, to support Gutel, the leader of the Gagauzia, a small autonomous region whose 140,000 residents are mainly ethnic Turks. The crowd demanded freedom for Gutel, chanting shame and criticising the government. The sentence can be appealed. Well, Andrew, thank you for staying with us. Initially, can I just get your reactions to this sentencing? Of course, a murky situation involving potentially Russia and some serious allegations.
Well, in all of those former Soviet republics, there are tensions, there are frictions between those who want to continue to have a close relationship with Russia, to be within its sphere of influence, as it were, and those who really see themselves as more European and want to attach themselves in various ways to the European Union, and in some cases perhaps even aspire to NATO membership. And so we see that playing out in context which it's ironic that Putin refers to a lack of democracy in Moldova, but he's not wrong. There's a lack of democracy in Russia, to be sure, but there's also a lack of democracy, meaningful democracy, as we would understand it, in various ex-Soviet republics and countries that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact. And so what we see here is, I think, a manipulation of the courts to squash one of those factions that favors a more pro-Russian orientation in favor of and by the forces that are supporting a more pro-EU orientation. I think that's what it boils down to at the end of the day.
Andrew, thank you ever so much, as always, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have your insight into those topics. We move on now, and a cloudburst has led to flash floods in the high-altitude villages of India's Uttarkashi. At least 4 people are dead, while many are feared to be washed away. As per reports, several houses are being damaged or being swept away in the raging water. A team of State Disaster Response Force personnel has been sent to the spot to undertake rescue operations. Reports suggest that the cloudburst took place in the catchment area of the Kir Ganga River, leading to the devastating flooding. Uttarakhand Chief Minister Pushkar Kumar Dhami has said that the situation is being closely monitored. Well, that is all that